Good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's Research Connects webinar. My name is Dr. Heather Cook, and I'm the Manager of Research and Knowledge Mobilization at the Alzheimer's Society of BC. And in addition to our guest speaker, Dr. Jennifer Baumbusch, I'm also joined today by Dr. Rakesh Korpal, our Provincial Coordinator of Research at the Society. As part of my role at the Society, I help make research more accessible by connecting researchers and experts in the field. And so this afternoon's presentation is the third in a new webinar series called Research Connects. And so I'm coming to you this afternoon from the sunny Okanagan, and I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that the land on which I'm speaking is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Silks Okanagan Nation. And I also acknowledge that you're joining us from near and far this afternoon. And so I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of those lands, past and present as well. Now, before we begin, please note that you can see the meeting controls by clicking or tapping at the bottom or the top of the meeting window. But in order to focus our attention on our guest speaker, we're going to keep everyone's microphones and cameras muted. So we definitely want to hear from you. So we would encourage you to use the chat box so that you can share your questions and your thoughts as we listen to Dr. Baumbusch today. And the chat box can be opened by clicking on the little dialogue bubble found on the meeting controls. We'll be monitoring the chat and we'll put your questions forward to Dr. Baumbusch once she's finished her presentation. So on that note, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Jennifer Baumbusch, who I've had the pleasure of working with for more than 6 years prior to my joining the Society. Dr. Baumbusch is a professor in the School of Nursing at UBC, where she directs a program of research on healthcare delivery and nursing practice with older adults. And her focus includes long-term residential care, family contributions to care delivery, well-being among individuals with intellectual disabilities in their families, and knowledge translation. And as we'll learn today, she's also added climate resilience to that interest as well. And so Jennifer is committed to community-based research principles through active engagement of individuals, clinicians, service providers, and organizations. So welcome, Jennifer, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Heather, for your kind introduction. And I'd like to thank the Society for inviting me today. And I didn't know today is the first of this webinar series, so I'm really thrilled to be with you all. I'm going to share my screen because I have a presentation, but as Heather said, I welcome everyone to share their thoughts in the chat, post questions for discussion at the end. I'd love to know your perspectives on this topic. So I'm just going to minimize everything on my screen so that I can see my slides. So I came coming to you today to talk about heat domes and atmospheric rivers, building climate resilience among people affected by dementia. And so how I came to this topic, I just get myself organized. Oh, first I'm going to start with an agenda, always a good idea for someone like myself to keep on track. So I'm going to start by sharing how I got involved in this area of climate change and climate resilience. Then I'm just going to share some terms that are common and that I've been learning about in this area. I'm going to talk about the susceptibility of people living with dementia during climate events. I think this is very important to be aware because people living with dementia are a high-risk population during weather emergencies. And then I'm going to share some strategies around building climate resilience. And I would love for people to share their ideas and strategies when we get to that part in the chat box, because part of it comes from research that other people have done. Part of it has come from community conversations. So I'm always curious and interested in learning about what solutions people have discovered for themselves. I'm going to share some web resources around weather emergencies and share a new study that our team is launching around climate resilience. So many of you who live in British Columbia will remember back in 2021, we were in the midst of the COVID pandemic. And just around this time of year, we experienced an unprecedented heat dome. It got really, really hot. And it stayed that way for several days. And during that experience, I felt really, really hot. And I am a full-time caregiver for my daughter who's disabled and medically complex. And we really needed to monitor her very closely because she has some differences in how she regulates her temperature, and we needed to come up with some other strategies to keep her cool during that time. So I was in the midst of this and thinking, well, who's doing great work in this area, particularly around older people? Because at the same time that we were experiencing the heat dome in our own home, I was learning that people participating in some of my research studies, of course, were also experiencing the extreme heat. And one of the studies that I've been doing for the past few years that Heather has been, I don't like to say worked on, but supported and was a huge part of that project, is a study where we're following families over time when the person living with dementia is living at home in the community to learn about their experiences, what kind of supports they need to be able to stay in the community, and those kinds of things. And sadly, during the heat dome, we learned that one of the families, one of the primary family caregivers, passed away. They had a massive cardiac event during the heat dome. And the person who they were caring for and supporting, who was living with dementia, was severely dehydrated and also needed to go to hospital. And they ultimately ended up moving into a long-term care home. And so, of course, that is the most tragic outcome that could have happened to any family during the heat dome. And then from there, we very quickly that summer moved into a lot of wildfires, regardless of where you lived in the province. I live in the Lower Mainland, so our experience of the wildfires is a lot around air quality, smoky air. And so we had that experience. And as you may recall, during that, one of the care homes in the interior had to be evacuated down to the Lower Mainland, which is a very unusual event. And it obviously doesn't happen very often. And then that was followed by the first time, I think, that we've really heard the term atmospheric river. And that involved heavy, heavy rain, again, over several days. And what we saw during that event were flooding, roads destroyed. People could not come from the interior to Lower Mainland. Even people in the Fraser Valley were experiencing severe flooding. And at that point, I had people from other studies and from people who know about the work I do contacting me to say, how are we going to get our medical supplies? Because there are lots of people around the province who rely on regular delivery of medical supplies. If they're tube fed or use vents or have other types of medical supplies they use regularly. And other people who said, here I am in my home, but I need to get to the hospital for dialysis. How am I going to do that? And if you recall, a lot of this was just total chaos. And so it really hit me. I never in my life expected, as someone who's worked for almost 30 years now in long-term care, working with older people and older aging families, that I would suddenly be thrown into the world of climate change and weather emergencies. But what has become very apparent over the last few years is that this is a crisis that is going to continue. We're going to continue experiencing weather emergencies. In British Columbia, if you've lived here for a long time, we always hear about earthquakes and earthquake preparedness. I feel like that's really being brought to the fore, but we haven't talked a lot about these other kinds of weather emergencies that we're experiencing around extreme heat, even extreme cold. We haven't quite experienced that yet, but I think we can be experiencing increasing snowstorms, depending, especially where you live in the province, wildfires we've had for many years now, but they're getting worse. And then with these atmospheric rivers and flooding that we're now experiencing. So when this all started to happen, I kind of looked around to say, well, who's doing the work in the area of climate resilience in older people? Because I have a lot of questions for them. And I found that in some parts of the world, there's excellent work happening, but not a lot happening in North America. And so I started to develop an interest in this. And as you can see, I've been contacted by the media. So I've talked in the media about this topic, and also have started to publish some papers around this to really start to raise awareness with other colleagues around the world that this is a crisis, and that for older people and people affected by dementia in particular, we need to be developing climate resilience. So you might say, like I did a few years ago, well, what's climate resilience, Jennifer? And so the first part of really learning about climate change and extreme weather emergencies was learning a whole new language around climate change. And so I just wanted to share some of the key terms I'm going to be using, or that you might learn about as you look at this area in the news or on the internet. So climate resilience is really around successfully coping with and managing the impacts of climate change while preventing those impacts from getting worse. So we want to get prepared, and we also want to prevent. And within the older adult population, I'm really talking about building up that resilience, building up awareness of what's happening, talking about strategies around how to minimize climate impacts and also be prepared for those climate emergencies. And so then there's a couple things that kind of flow from that. One is mitigation measures. So how do we prevent further climate change from happening? So we hear about this in the news all the time, shifting away from fossil fuels, getting electric cars, getting rid of our gas stoves, and also shifting to heat pumps and those kinds of mechanical cooling and heating devices. So we hear a lot about those kinds of mitigation measures that we can take up. And then there are adaptation measures, which is sort of the other piece of it. Things are happening, so we need to have strategies to take care of ourselves and take care of our planet as they're happening. So these are really strategies against existing threats and preparing for more changes. So a lot of the work that I've been doing, and I just want to acknowledge here, there are amazing climate scientists around the world and here at British Columbia. And the area that I have sort of found myself working more in are these adaptation measures. So here we are sitting in the heat or with really poor air quality or really isolated because there's been an emergency. What do we do? And thinking about what we do at the individual level, the community level, and the government level. So I'm going to get to that in the second part of my presentation, but this first part is more around just talking about what is the susceptibility and why is it there for people living with dementia during climate events? Because I think it's really important to understand why you might want to be taking special care during these times. I'm going to talk about each of the major weather emergencies that we've been experiencing in turn. So heat events, I think, are the big one where it's really around a lot of bodily changes that can happen either as a normal age-related process or as part of dementia as a chronic illness. And so thinking about, are these things happening in me? Everybody sort of chronologically ages at different rates, but these are the types of things that you can expect and ought to be really looking out for. And I've called this heat and humidity because it's really important to realize that humidity plays also a big role in how warm we feel and how we respond during hot weather. And for those of us living in the Lower Mainland like myself, we experience quite a humid heat. I've had the great fortune earlier in my life to travel to desert places like in California, where it's a very dry heat. I feel like in Canada, we talk a lot about dry and wet heat and humid heat and dry and wet, cold, and we all know what that feels like, I think. And so we don't just want to be looking at the thermometer in terms of what is the degree, but also thinking about the humidity and how that's impacting us. So during heat events, the main things that we want to be thinking about, and some of these are older adults in general, and some of them are related to dementia. So temperature regulation changes as people age. And so we call that thermoregulation. And that's really your sense of, how hot do I feel? Do I recognize, does my brain recognize that I'm feeling hot right now and that I need to do something to respond to that? And so sometimes you'll see people on a warm day wrapped in many sweaters and you think, why are you wearing so many sweaters? And it might be that their body isn't, and their brain isn't sending them a signal to say, you're feeling really hot, take off some of those sweaters. So we need to be thinking about that as we're around other people. Are they able to regulate their temperature well? The other thing that can happen as people age is that there's reduced sweating. So your body's getting hot, but doesn't have a way of getting rid of it, as you might have when you were younger. So you need to be thinking about, my insides might be getting pretty warm and my body doesn't have a way to get rid of it. Dehydration is another piece. As we age, we also need to be drinking more fluids. And so figuring out, what kind of fluids do you like to drink? What kind of impact are they having on your body? Ideally, of course, we like people to be drinking water, in addition to other fluids during the day, because dehydration can be a big concern. And then there are certain medications that can impact a person's response during heat events. And the kinds of medications that tend to worsen people's responses during heat events are the medications that some people with dementia might be taking. So it's really important to understand the impact of those medications and how they can impact you in a heat event. And then the last thing, particularly around people living with dementia who may have differences in the way they communicate how they're feeling, instead of sort of seeing someone have what we might think of as the typical signs of being too hot or experiencing heat illness, people's behaviors can change. So people might become more agitated. They might be experiencing what we call also a delirium. And so that's an acute health issue. It's an emergency. And people need to get to the hospital and need to have that treated. So sometimes all of these other things, in all other ways, people might not be looking too unusual during the heat and humidity, but their behavior is changing. And we need to take that as something that needs to be investigated medically. So that's really some of those major body changes that can happen during heat events that we want to be aware of and we want to be thinking about. And later on, I'll talk about some of those adaptation measures we can apply during those situations to address them. The second area is really around wildfires. And so during that, it's not so much bodily changes, but we really want to be thinking about air quality. And again, changes in air quality can impact a person's behaviors because they might not be feeling that great because of the air quality, and they might not be saying, I don't feel great because of the air quality, but we're going to be seeing some differences in their behavior. One of the really interesting things I've learned in my journey over the last few years of learning is around the impact of air pollution on dementia, and that air pollution can actually contribute to cognitive impairment. So we really want to be thinking about air quality in all aspects, but especially during the wildfires. And then a big part for some of us who live in certain areas of the province is evacuation. And that's the other aspect that really, where a person living with dementia and people who are supporting them can really be impacted. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about how to deal with those situations in a little bit. So then we get to the atmospheric rivers, new terminology for many of us, and that's really around the flooding. And again, we're thinking about potential for evacuation and being prepared for evacuation. Loss of access and roads flooded. So sometimes that isolation that can come up over a prolonged period of time where we're not able to access medical care or other things that we need, and we're quite isolated. And I guess one of the things, and a lot of this, I should also say, between wildfires and what happens during atmospheric rivers is a little bit overlapping, because I'm thinking of people right now who are in Ucluelet and Tofino, and I read a news report the other day that their main road is blocked by wildfires. And so thinking about multiple ways of supporting people who might live in more isolated communities and having more than one road to be able to get out and get around. And then the other thing here also is around inaccessible healthcare services. And I've talked a lot about people going out and needing to access care in hospitals or clinics, but that also impacts on in-home supports. And so if people are having home support workers, for example, or paid care providers coming into their home, During some of these weather emergencies, and especially if you lose access to roads, they won't be able to come and provide that kind of support. So thinking about what do you do in those situations where you're expecting some help to come into the home, but they aren't able to come in and support you. So those are sort of the general things I think that are impacting people affected by dementia overall. And then there are also additional factors that can impact individuals and increase their susceptibility. And these kind of factors are also looking at something called climate vulnerability. So it's another term for your toolbox. And climate vulnerability describes the degree to which natural, built, and human systems are at risk of exposure to climate change impacts. And these factors include, but are not limited to, race, class, sexual orientation and identification, national origin, and income inequality. So I was looking at a few that in particular are going to be impacting people living with dementia and those who are caring for them. One is gender. We know that women tend to be more impacted during weather emergencies, and this obviously relates to some of these other factors. During the heat dome and the reports on the people who died during the heat dome, there was a majority of women who died. This is also impacted by income because, of course, people who are living in poverty will have less access and ability to pay for some of the strategies that come in when we talk about adaptation measures. Housing adequacy is a big issue. So where a person lives, the type of housing, there's a lot of people in Vancouver area now who are living in high rises with windows that don't open. They may not have access to an elevator, so they might be looking at getting up and down a lot of stairs every day, things that put a lot of pressure on your cardiovascular and respiratory systems. So all of these things, the sort of power infrastructure that you have and how many fans you can have going or mechanical cooling devices, all of these things are around housing adequacy and whether or not people are able to enact a lot of these strategies during weather emergencies. Transportation availability, I think, is extremely important, particularly as people are getting older and may not have their own vehicle anymore, or they may not be using a vehicle anymore, that when these calls for evacuation in particular come up, how do you evacuate if you don't have a personal vehicle? And how is the government looking at that capacity within communities for people to leave and whether or not they are providing the transportation? So that's a really important piece, I think, around this population. And then capacity of the healthcare system. And so one of the things that we see in the research is that particularly during those extreme weather events and the heat in particular, is that there's increased pressure on our emergency departments. And anyone who even watches a little bit of the news these days knows that our emergency departments are generally not prepared for what is going to happen during these types of weather emergencies because they're already overloaded. We also have to think about our paramedics and emergency response systems. So during the heat dome in 2021, a lot of the issues that arose was around capacity of the emergency response system to get to people. The story that I shared at the beginning around the family with the very tragic outcome of the caregiver who passed away, they had called 911, I believe, 3 times, and it took a prolonged period of time for the paramedics to come to their home, by which time the person who was experiencing the emergency had already passed away. So we really need to think about how do we build our healthcare system so that it's prepared for when these events happen. And it's not just on the day of. So a lot of the studies that I've looked at, and I say a lot, but there's very few studies actually around what happens with people affected by dementia during heat events, but it's not on day one. So typically the first day we start getting hot, we're still doing okay, but it's over the course of time when these are extended heat periods where on day 2 or especially on day 3, those signs and symptoms of dehydration and heat illness really start to appear, and people end up going to the emergency department. And then I think on the other piece of capacity is really having healthcare professionals who understand aging, who can work with older adults, understand that this population may present differently than people who are younger or middle-aged, and that people living with dementia, their main differences may be behavioral changes. And so really investigating to see what is the underlying cause. Is that underlying cause dehydration or other issues? And so we really need to be thinking about developing that capacity within our healthcare system, because that is a significant source of vulnerability for people, I think, living in British Columbia and other jurisdictions. So that's a lot of information, and I just want to recognize that. And now I'm going to shift a bit to be talking about, well, okay, that wasn't such a great situation that I shared with you, and there's lots of risks, obviously. So how are we going to go about building climate resilience among people living with dementia and their care partners? And during this part of my presentation, I really would love for people who are here today to put in the chat box your strategies. I'm really curious. I read a lot, I talk with people a lot, but I know that people are always coming up with really unique strategies themselves. So I thought, if possible, we could use a little bit of this time as well for people to pop that in the chat. And when we get to the discussion in a little bit, we can look at some of those strategies that you share. So I'm going to share the ones that I have. Again, there's a fair amount of overlap between wildfires and flooding. And some of this, again, is evidence-based, comes from the literature, and some of it comes from just the best practices that we know that people are using in their daily lives. So I've set this up so we can think about it, again, in terms of the individual, community, and government, because I think that all of us have the capacity. We need to prepare ourselves. We also need to think about how do we change and affect and shift some of those structural issues so that we bring down everybody's vulnerability and increase everybody's resilience. And that's really the goal of working with community and government. And so I guess, 1 year after the heat dome, the main thing that shifted in our province was around communications of extreme heat. And I think we need to go further than that. I'll be honest. I think, it's one thing around people getting that information, but we really need to go beyond that to giving people really tangible supports and changing things and recognizing that these weather emergencies weren't a one-off. And so far already this spring, we've had 2, they weren't heat domes, but we had 2 heat waves so far in May. And a lot of community groups weren't quite ready for that because there are strategies they had in place to start this month. And so we have to be thinking, and I think just yesterday it snowed in Calgary. So we have to be thinking about this 12 months a year. And it's not just going to maybe happen in the summer, but we have to be prepared all the time. And we really need to make some significant shifts in our structures and in our infrastructures, because this is going to now continue for the foreseeable future. So in terms of the heat events at the individual levels, I think knowing the signs and symptoms of heat illness, and I have some web resources coming up in a slide in a bit that give you links to these, and it's fairly simple to Google and get that information. But the other really important piece is knowing for yourself, if you're a person who is living with dementia or caring for someone living with dementia, what does that look like for them? And again, going back to those behavioral changes, and I'll give you an example from my own life with my daughter, that she can become quite agitated. And sometimes that involves calling out or being very repetitive. And it's different than her typical behavior and her typical style of communicating. So we know that even if she doesn't say, I'm thirsty, or I'm feeling hot, or I just don't feel good, that when we see those changes, we think, oh, something is different for her, and start to think, what are we doing? Does she have an ice pack right now on her body? Does she have water? Do I need to give more verbal prompts around drinking the water? Because even if it's in front of her, she's not going to, necessarily pick that water bottle up and drink it. So giving those regular verbal prompts, making sure that we're thinking those things through all the time. So knowing the signs and symptoms of heat illness in general, and thinking about even how to recognize them in yourself. Care partners, particularly those who are cohabitating, perhaps doing a lot of meal prep, doing the cleaning, doing some personal care, that's a load on us. Excuse me. And so really thinking about, when do I know when I'm not feeling good? Or have I had my own water to drink today? Or thinking, I've seen this announcement on the news that there's going to be a heat wave or it's going to get really hot, and maybe pre-preparing some meals and putting them in the freezer so I'm not standing at the hot stove for an hour or however long. So just doing that self-reflection as a care partner about what does this look like for me? What do I need to do to prepare for myself so that I can continue supporting this individual? And then having cooling and hydration strategies. And there are lots of good ideas that people have shared. And so, some of them involve having a cool shower or cool bath. But even if a person isn't really mobile enough to be doing that, having those kind of ice packs and having a set of them in your freezer if you have space, those can be purchased quite inexpensively, and wrapping them in a towel or in an extra pillowcase and putting those against the body. And then also having those hydration strategies. So for myself, I start the day with a bottle of water in the fridge. And I know that by the end of the day, I want that big bottle to be finished. So that every time I open up the fridge for a snack, which is frequent for me, I see my water bottle up right there looking at me. So thinking about that. And people, again, have other great ideas, making a cloth wet, putting it in the freezer so you can wrap it around your neck. Also having fans, thinking about, when's the coolest part of the day, trying not to let your home heat up that much. And this ties into the government strategies, because for some people, that's just not possible. Or spending time outside. One of the things that we absolutely saw during the heat dome was that the cooling centers were in common areas. And so people would look at these cooling centers and say, yes, but everything I'm being told about COVID is I shouldn't be sitting in this space with other people. And so really thinking through, where is your cooling space? Can you create one in your own home or in your building where you live, or even get one in your community? All of these things, thinking ahead around that. Decreasing activities, I've already talked about that. Making sure that your cardiac load isn't too heavy during those really hot times. And then for the person who's affected by dementia, even in yourself, one of the things that occurs with aging is people tend to be on more medications, and there can be interactions among those medications. Some medications can make a person more susceptible to poor outcomes during extreme heat. So talk to your pharmacist. Pharmacists are an amazing resource, I feel. I have a great relationship with ours, and I really encourage you to speak with your pharmacist about, is this something I need to be concerned about? And what should we do when the weather starts to get hot? In terms of community, there can be neighbor check-ins. So if you have a community where you can all check in on each other, whether it's a phone call, the person lives next door so you can see them, or some of these amazing apps we have now like WhatsApp, and just having a little neighborhood group to be checking in. And sometimes if you're on your own, that also means just, finding your person that can be your check-in person. And I have a neighbor nearby who lives on their own. And so we have a little communication strategy set up so that I know if anything happens with them. So I think setting up those neighbor check-ins is really key. A lot of community groups, neighborhood houses are distributing fans and other cooling devices, which can be very helpful. Fans are expensive. During the heat dome, we saw people purchasing all the fans at the stores and then reselling them on eBay for huge amounts, absolutely pricing out people that are low income or fixed income or lots of different kinds of income could not pay for those fans. So personally, I have purchased fans in the fall when they're on sale. And if you have space, and I know a lot of people don't, but if you do have space, just putting them away until the next time there's hot weather. And then having accessible cooling centers. And I use the word accessible a lot in my presentation because I think, for a lot of people, the original cooling centers were not that accessible. Because you're like, you want me to leave my house or my apartment, when I say home, lots of different kinds of homes, go somewhere in the heat to sit in the cool and then head home again because they close at 8 p.m. or 10 p.m. So I think that our cooling centers, we really need to think about having them 24/7. But not everyone can physically get to one. So if you're living in a building where there's a common room, working with the people in your building to create cooling spaces that maybe people can all gather in is really key. And then with the government, really, we need to be advocating around having much greater financial supports around mechanical cooling. And by that, I mean heat pumps and air conditioners, because we need people to have access to these. If we continue to have temperatures like we had in the heat domes, the fans are not going to help us. So we need to really look at mechanical cooling. We don't think anything about having furnaces in our house. And I had a very short period of my life where I lived in Ontario in my early 20s, and I was amazed that people had air conditioning in their homes. Like, I had never seen that. And I think that's not something that's being the norm here in British Columbia, but that needs to change. Building codes need to change to require this kind of mechanical cooling. The city of Vancouver updated some of their building codes, but that's just for new builds. And so we know that the people who are at greatest risk, people living in poverty, people with inadequate housing, women, people with chronic illnesses, with psychiatric illnesses, they are not moving into our new builds that are priced out of most people's ability to purchase. So we need to be changing and expecting existing housing to have mechanical cooling. And that, of course, then we think about the power infrastructure we have. And so far, we've been okay in British Columbia, but we also know that there are parts of the world not that far away that have regular blackouts, emergency power blackouts, because of the heavy load on their system. So we need to be thinking about how do we ensure that our power infrastructure is going to be able to support what people need moving forward. So the next piece, and again, if you have anything to add around the heat, please put it in the chat for when we get to the end. The next piece is around addressing needs related to wildfires. Again, there's a lot of overlap here with the flooding, but the first one is really important around in-home air quality. People who did research around earthquakes in Japan found that people's cognitive impairment actually declined due to poor air quality and having to move to new housing. So all of these disruptions, and really when we're thinking about the wildfires and the flooding, it's around the disruption and how does that impact an individual? So definitely thinking about in-home air quality. Again, we need to have government-funded air purifiers, closing our windows, and that can be really hard because oftentimes the wildfires are coinciding with hot weather. So thinking about how to keep our indoor air quality as good as possible. Having an evacuation plan, really key. And then in community, mobilizing community supports and agencies around evacuation readiness. So it's almost too late when we get the notice that it's time to go. So thinking about how community organizations can support people to be ready. What is your evacuation plan? In one study around Hurricane Katrina, for example, where people were evacuating due to the flooding and their homes being destroyed, afterwards, it became an expectation that people connected with the health systems would have an evacuation plan. So can you imagine here in British Columbia, if part of people's in-home inter-RI assessments from their health authorities involved a question around, do you have an evacuation plan? Do you need support around that? And then organizing community salons post-emergency. So we're not just thinking before, during, but we need to think about after, and giving people space to debrief, giving people space to connect, giving people sort of a sense of normalcy so that they're reconnecting, participating in activities, doing the kinds of things that are going to help them feel safe and supported. And then in terms of the government, again, accessible evacuation, transportation, and centers are so important. In Australian research around wildfires and evacuations, one of the things that care partners talk about is just, I know how disruptive the evacuation will be to the person I'm caring for. Therefore, I'm sort of split. Like, do we go to the evacuation center or do we stay here and put ourselves at risk? And a lot of people are putting themselves at risk. Evacuation centers can be overwhelming. They're a new environment. It can trigger people to become very agitated or withdraw. And so we need to think about, how do we create centers that are going to have space available for people who are cognitively impaired or have neurodiversities. The other piece around that is making sure that people potentially can access accessible hotel rooms. So what we've seen here in British Columbia is there's no sort of holding back of those spaces. And so anyone who arrives at the hotel during an evacuation can get the accessible hotel room. And so when people show up who actually need that as an accommodation, it's not available to them. So thinking about what resources do we have? How do we ensure that the population has access to them? And again, having those funded air purifiers, they are also not inexpensive, and so we need systems to get them into people's homes and minimize their out-of-pocket costs. So the last area I'm going to talk about is the flooding. And again, there's a fair amount of overlap here with the wildfires. But for the individual, doing your risk assessment and having an evacuation plan. Again, I think a lot of us who live in British Columbia have sort of had it drilled into us that we need to have an earthquake plan, but we also now know we need to have a plan if flooding or wildfires require us to leave our homes. And also for people who are living with dementia, potentially limiting their exposure to media about the weather event, because it can create a lot of anxiety for people. And we know that sometimes that's a bit of an information overload. So thinking about managing how much information they're getting about that weather event. In the community, some of the research that's been done has been around people who live in supportive housing and long-term care homes. And again, similar to having an evacuation plan for people living in community, to be thinking, okay, if we need to evacuate the care home, is that individual able to go live with family for a short period of time, or do they need to go to the new place where we're evacuating to? And working with staff to ensure that's part of an individual's care plan and that it's being renewed and reviewed annually. So you can think, what is the plan, and is there a place for them to stay where they might feel more comfortable, more in a home-like environment than moving to an entirely new community. And in terms of the government at this level, I think a lot of what's come up for people is around medication and medical supply reserves. If you're unexpectedly isolated, you may need to have a week or 2 weeks worth of those medications. And one of the complications that we have is that some of our medications are understandably closely monitored. So you can get a 30-day supply. You can't get your new supply until you've used up that supply. But in the case of emergency, where you may not be able to get to a pharmacy, you may not be able to access the physician who's prescribing, what do we do? And so thinking about in communities, in some people's homes to have a backup supply, and sometimes having it within the community. And also that goes for medical supply reserves. And so ensuring that people who do depend on medical equipment to live, that there are reserves within their community or within their home that they can access. And again, oftentimes these are done on 30-day rotations, and you're not able to have that extra supply. So really changing some of those policies and procedures so that people do have an extra supply in case of emergency. And again, that we have a lot of work going in our province around emergency response, et cetera. and thinking about who do we need to prioritize for evacuation, and making sure that potentially some people are being helped out of their community early because they might be relying on transportation, or they just need to get out and to a safe and secure place before that weather emergency really hits. So I think those are the main strategies and adaptation measures that I wanted to recommend today. And I think these are some really great web resources. There are a lot. And so if you're going out to look, you could easily become overwhelmed. And so I'll just warn you, there's a lot out there. Crip Care is a BC-based citizen-created website. They have a lot of information. So if you were hearing me talk, and you're like, Jennifer, I want more information about why these medications are impacting, or what's the aging body got to do with being more vulnerable during heat events. This is such a comprehensive website. They've really pulled together information about why things happen, and then a lot of the strategies around what to do. Fraser Health, I've pulled this one up. I live in Fraser Health, and so they have websites around preparing for heat events. Health Canada as well has, fact sheets and all sorts of things. And then Prepared BC has a very comprehensive report around emergency preparedness. So you can find as much information as you want around how to prepare for climate emergencies and build your climate resilience. These are just 4 examples that I've highlighted. And, I think that, again, this is something that we need to think about all year round, not just when we get into the summer months. So there's a lot of great information for you that you can read or listen to, and start to come up with some of your own plans for building climate resilience at both the individual level, but also within your community, and how to advocate for government to make some changes. I'm just going to wrap up by telling you about a new study that I'm doing. I'm working with researchers also at McGill University, and it's understanding and enhancing the climate resilience of older adults in Canada. I'm really thrilled to have this CIHR grant to really be starting to look at specifically what can we do in some of our Canadian jurisdictions. So what we're going to be doing is looking at policies around municipalities. For this particular project, we're quite focused on urban areas. I absolutely recognize research needs to be done around rural as well. But to start with, we're going to be looking at municipal policies around extreme weather events. We're going to be doing a systematic literature review. So I've been currently doing a review around how people affected by dementia experience extreme weather events, but we're going to broaden that out a little bit to look more at older people. And we're also going to be doing focus groups with older adults, care partners, and people who work and plan with older adults during weather emergencies. And we're going to be doing those focus groups in BC and in Metro Vancouver and Montreal, but we will have opportunities to do them virtually. So if you're interested in knowing more about this research, just to get on our mailing list for updates and newsletters, I'll give you my contact information in a moment. But especially if you're interested in participating in one of those focus groups, I would love to hear from you so that when we get to the point where we're doing that, we can reach out to you to see if you'd like to participate. And the focus groups will really be focused on what is your experience of weather emergencies? What kind of strategies have you found that work for you? And then developing some recommendations out of that. So that brings me to my conclusion. This is the best way to get a hold of me. I don't do the telephone too much. I'm quite hard of hearing, and so I have a hard time with a telephone. So it's always appreciated if you email me first, and then we can set up something if you'd like to chat on the phone or on a Zoom. So my email address is gero@nursing.ubc.ca. That's GERO@nursing.ubc.ca. I'm also on Twitter a lot if you'd like to find me there, and it's at Gero Nursing, GERO NURSING. And I also like to acknowledge the person who made the fabulous graphics for my presentation. It is Diana Salcido, and she's a wonderful person that I've connected with through our community of families of children with disabilities. So again, feel free to reach out. I always love to connect with people, hear your stories, and really think about how we can start addressing this issue around climate resilience, both within our own communities and more broadly. So thank you. And I will stop there and come back to our group to see if we have any recommendations around strategies or any questions about what I've talked about.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for that presentation. So much to learn for me, I'm sure for everyone else there as well. And such a timely presentation coming up into the summer months. There's a few questions. One, you mentioned developing capacity in the healthcare system and healthcare professionals. So I was just wondering, like, how do you see that? How could we support healthcare professionals, support people living with dementia?
Absolutely. I think it's a really great question. And again, I think as somebody who's been in this area of practice for 30 years, it never occurred to me that I need to know about this stuff. And so I'm someone who's already coming from that perspective. And the vast majority of healthcare professionals do not specialize in working with older people or people living with dementia. And so I think part of it is some of our pre-licensure programs are starting to integrate content around climate change and climate resilience. And so really teaching people about it, but continuing with continuing education. Hopefully, you know, my dream would be to create a bit of an online course around this for some people. And I guess also it's not knowing the fundamentals of caring for a person living with dementia or older adults in general is something most people will have learned. And so it's a bit of a reminder to, you know, say they might not appear in the emergency department quite like how you're expecting, but these are some things to look for. And I think it unfortunately takes some advocacy on the part of care partners who accompany people to the emergency department, if you're able to do that, to say, this is this person when they're not feeling good, and you need to investigate. So just from my own experience as well as a caregiver, knowing that a lot of advocacy is sometimes required to be clear that this is not a progression of the illness, that this is new and unusual and needs to be looked at.
Great, thank you for that. Another question that we had is, there was a lot of talk about accessibility and how important it is. So for people living specifically in rural, remote communities, we can see how big an issue that can be for all climate resilience, adaptation, mitigation strategies. So would you have any suggestions for that specific population?
I think that's a great question. And I think with British Columbia having accessibility legislation coming online, I would encourage people to be as involved in that with your communities and organizations as possible. All public agencies will be required to have accessibility committees, and, you know, being present and having our voices at those tables is going to be really key. And I think in terms of the rural populations, a lot of it is around, you know, remaining in place versus evacuation. I think the heat types of strategies are quite consistent, but it's really around those choices. Do we risk staying here where we are, or do we evacuate? And so I think, again, raising those questions within your community, if you have an evacuation center, if you have, you know, raised questions around transportation, flagging this for people. Because I think, unfortunately, people who haven't experienced issues around accessibility in their life don't necessarily think that far along the road when they are making the plans. And so much of this is around having a seat at the table. And maybe you don't get on the committee, but you can write a letter. You know, all of those kinds of things really help. And it's not, you know, a lot of times people are like, oh, we hadn't thought about that. So get them thinking about it.
And just to follow up to that, how would someone know where the evacuation center is or a cooling room is close by? Is there any kind of website or?
So this is a big issue, I think, is the decentralization of information around a lot of communities. And so I live in Burnaby, and, you know, on social media. And if you're not on social media for any other reason, and then we get into issues of internet accessibility, I mean, it just unfolds and you could go on and on. But I live in Burnaby. I make sure that I, follow my municipality on social media, and I follow Burnaby Neighborhood House, and I know that they're going to be good sources of information. So I think this is a huge issue. And this is why when the government put out, we're going to have these communication strategies, well, that's great, but you're not telling me what's happening within my community, right? Or, contacting your local health unit. Health authorities are increasing the number of staff they have who are climate focused, which is great. Even again, doing sort of that search of your local health authority website, doing a simple Google search, evacuation centers for your community. Unfortunately, it takes a lot of reaching out a lot of the time. And so then within your small informal community, sharing that information, right? Did you know? So definitely communication is something that still remains quite decentralized, and the onus is on the individual a lot of the time to seek that out for their own community.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question about research. So what areas would you consider for future research related to community dwelling older adults with complex care needs for such emergencies?
In terms of emergencies,
Mm-hmm.
I think that is where, there's some really interesting things I've read about around psychological first aid. I think sometimes we forget how incredibly stressful these situations are for all of us. I've started to look at the literature around climate anxiety, and it is really just with younger people. And so I think that in so many ways, we have 3 minutes, so I can't talk too much about ageism, but older people have really not been included in a lot of the climate work to date. And so I'm quite curious about issues around climate anxiety in this population. How do we create psychological supports for people? But really, I think this is going to be community-based research, working with people in community. What do you need? And then building it up from there. Because we do have many unique communities within British Columbia, and what works for me sitting in Burnaby is not going to work for people in the interior or in the north. So doing really community-based, but then connecting everybody. And I know that there's connections at the organizational level sometimes among the nonprofits, but for the actual individuals at home looking to get engaged and involved, there might not be as many opportunities. So I would like to see those increase as well, for sure.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And one final question about your own research.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the research will be in Vancouver, Montreal.
Yeah.
Any specific reason why those two places?
So it's really interesting because Montreal has experienced heat domes and heat events earlier in the 2000s, and they immediately created heat event policies and programs that were quite comprehensive. And when the same thing happened in Vancouver, we didn't do that. We're kind of like, oh, well, I guess that happened, and kind of kept going along. And so we're in a way comparing communities where one has really created in a very intentional way policies and programs that have been in place now for a while to support people during heat events, with a place that has had a heat event but didn't do that. And so are people experiencing different things? But this is always shifting because, of course, what they're experiencing right now in Montreal are wildfires and air quality issues. So I've actually been working with my partner because now they've said, I think we need to move up our focus groups and talk about what's happened this year. So this is such a quickly evolving type of situation that our research, fortunately, can be very flexible in terms of being able to look at different weather emergencies and different situations. So I would say we're not limited to Vancouver, Montreal, but that was the original reason, was because of the different ways that those places have responded to heat emergencies.
Thank you. And one quick final word from me. We hope that you'll be back as your research progresses and just kind of disseminating all the work and the results that you get. And I will hand it over to Heather now for concluding comments.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again to Jennifer for taking time out of her day to share that great knowledge, and to everyone on the call for joining in. And just a reminder, the recording will be available on our YouTube channel. So for folks who weren't able to make it today, we'd love to hear your feedback. So we hope that you'll take the time to complete the post-event survey, which you can find in the chat. We'll post it in there. And we invite you to share your thoughts on future topic areas for the webinar series. And we hope you'll join us for our next Research Connects, which will be in September, which is World Alzheimer's Month. And Rakesh and I will take you behind the dementia-related research headlines to help you learn how to evaluate the credibility of a story or a source. And so details for that, including a registration link, will be posted at alzbc.org/webinars. Anyways, thanks again to all of you for joining us, and hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.